Good morning, everyone. This is your very own Harshad Pandit Harry, and today I'm going to talk on the aspects of the foundations of poetry in terms of the poetic form, the poetic structure, and the poetic voice that is, with special impetus on things like line break, rhythm, imagery, voice, and tone. Firstly, I would like to thank Mr. Emmanuel Chimizi, the founder of Poets Workshop Global, for giving me an opportunity to address a wonderful audience like you. So, welcome you all for the talk. To begin with, what is poetry exactly? It is something that relies on the interplay of words in the form of its own form, structure, and voice. Now, what it does, it transforms language into an emotional and sensory experience. So what it does by doing that is it intentionally shapes the layout, rhythm, and persona to establish a meaning beyond the literal definitions of words. So now these three pillars, the form, structure, and voice, serve as the fundamental architecture of poetry. To begin with, poetic form, or some call it as genre. So these are of three types. The fixed forms, which adhere to certain rigid structural framework. Something like a sonnet that consists of 14 lines. A villanelle that features 19 lines with some repeating refrains. Haiku, a typical 5-7 syllable count poem. Then there is something called as blank verse. It lacks a fixed rhyme scheme, but it relies heavily on regular metric patterns, specifically certain unrhymed iambic parameters. And lastly, the free verse. It rejects any fixed formulae and does not follow any established rules of rhyme meter. So what it does, it grants total freedom to the poet over line lengths, natural speech cadences. The second aspect, the poetic structure, which is the foundation or the mechanical arrangement of the poem's internal parts, similar to a body's internal organs and parts. So what it does is it manages the visual layout, controls the reading speed, and builds an arousal or an element of interest. When we delineate a poem, what it does is that individual rows of text, they form the basic building blocks of any poetry. Something called as line break or enjambment, breaks a sentence without actual punctuation. Now what it does, it accentuates the pace of a poetry. Alternatively, certain end stop lines conclude with a punctuation to force a distinct pause. Then poetries are also divided into stanzas. These are lines that are grouped together which function like paragraphs, analogous to prose to isolate or develop specific concepts. Now, as an example, we have doublets or couplets, tercets, quatrains, and so on. Then an important aspect of meter and rhythm that forms the basis of the foundation of poetry. So meter dictates the underlying rhythmic grid. It focuses upon the stressed and unstressed syllables into something called as feet, which are nothing but units. So an iambic foot matches an unstressed syllable with a stressed one. And lastly, the volta as a structural element that serves or becomes the emotional pivot of a narrative, and it gives a poem's tone a drastic shift or introduces an element of surprise or a suspense as a matter of granting an altogether new perspective. Lastly, the poetic voice. which is the persona and the delivery. Okay, so it grants the attitude and character behind who is the speaker. It establishes an emotional connect between the poet and the reader. It also turns abstract concepts into personal experiences. Okay, so something like the speaker himself, right? He is the narrative or the persona who is delivering his work. Okay, so he can adapt an imaginary character, an object, an animal, an inanimate object, or an autobiographical point of view through his composition. Then the tone, it reflects the attitude towards the subject matter, whether it is mournful, ironic, ecstatic, or detached. Then comes diction. The word choice establishes the voice of a poem. Now, high formal diction creates distance and reverence, while colloquial and casual language implies intimacy or grit. And lastly, imagery or syntax. Okay, the sensory language, what happens, it grounds the speaker's voice in physical realm, while the arrangement of sentences or those lines or phrases, which we call it as syntax, it controls the voice's clarity, fragmentation, and urgency. With what intention and to what extent or to how much does the poet wants to go deeper and delve deeper into his subject of choice as a topic, as a prompt. The most distinctive tool in any poet's arsenal is a line break. Okay, so unlike prose where the margin dictates where a sentence ends, in poetry a poet chooses exactly where to interrupt his flow. A line break, then what it does, it creates a hinge of a meaning. By ending a line on a strong noun or a verb, the poet can create an element of suspense or emphasis that I spoke about a little while ago. And breaking a line mid-phrase, which we also refer as enjambment, it mimics the feeling of deceleration or acceleration of the speed, while ending on a full stop or a comma, that is a punctuation, provides a sense of finality to the poem for that particular line. The rhythm and imagery, what do? They serve as the heartbeat and eyes of the poem. Rhythm does not always mean following a particular rhyme scheme. However, it reflects the musicality or the rhythmic cadence of the language, analogous to a wave. It is nothing but a pulse created by the arrangement of stressed and unstressed syllables. And how do we do that? By using tools like imagery, concrete sensory details that allow the reader to feel, to see, to smell, okay, to be there actually where the poet intends the reader to take. Okay, so something like writing about sadness, instead of that, if a poet describes a damp or a morose setting, it immediately conveys to the reader as to what are the intentions of the poet. Okay, so concrete details, what happens, it grounds the reader and making abstract emotions look real. Lastly, the voice and tone, they represent a poem's personality. Okay, the voice is nothing but the who behind the words, that is the speaker's identity, while the tone gives us a knowledge about or an information about the speaker's attitude towards his subject. Okay, so a consistency in voice is of utmost importance, wherein the poem feels like a cohesiveness rather than a random collection of an amalgamation of lines. Okay, to touch upon, the topic also encompasses how to begin a poem effectively. Okay, it might seem the hardest part, yes, to some extent it is, but however, a very effective poem often starts in media res, that is in the middle of things. Never do provide a very long or boring explanation analogous to a moral of a story. Instead, a poem should start with a sharp image or a provocative statement that raises the arousal aspect, right? So by focusing on small physical foundations of the world, the poet chooses to create a gateway between himself and the reader for an emotional connect. Okay, so the structure provides the skeleton, but the poet's choices in rhythm, imagery, and voice provide the breath and life of poetry. So to conclude, read a lot, practice a lot, and try different poetic forms. Just to make it more effective, do not deviate from the subject matter and do not try too much of experimentation. Yes, you might delve upon different poetic forms. You might go for free verse, you might go for a sonnet, you might go for a villanelle, but see to it that you do not deviate from the topic. And the starting, that is the effective start, is when it is catchy. It should grasp the reader and it should instigate an element of arousal and instigate an element of interest in knowing what the next line is. So dear friends, that's all for today. I hope my little words were encouraging enough and informative and knowledge sharing. Once again, thanks to the entire administration team of the Poets Workshop Global, especially Mr. Emmanuel Chimezi, for giving me the opportunity. Thank you very much. Love you all and God bless you. This is Harshad Pandit signing off from India. God bless you all.